Real-Time 1960s presents Evening Report, a complete roundup of today's news with Joe Rubenstein.
Good evening. In Washington, cheers for astronaut Gordon Cooper. In Vietnam, a major communist attack. In New York, a birthday party for the president. Martin Luther King speaks out, and Mickey Mantle launches a baseball into outer space. Those are the headlines. The details after this message.
Coffee, fresh, rich, deep in flavor. Coffee hot and dark, a whole lot of coffee. Have it. Coffee that warms and pleases your life a little, and for the time of a cupful, makes it that much more enjoyable. This is today's Sanka coffee. It is meant to be enjoyed a lot. Another fine product of General Foods. Have a whole day of it.
At New York City's Waldorf Astoria Hotel last night, President Kennedy, who will turn 46 on May 29th, attended a premature, star-studded birthday dinner presented by the President's Club of New York. More than 600 club members, who had obtained membership by giving $1,000 or more to the Democratic National Committee, attended the celebration. The musical performance part of the evening was produced by Alan J. Lerner, who wrote the book and lyrics for My Fair Lady and Camelot. Mr. Kennedy, after hearing Audrey Hepburn sing Happy Birthday, delivered some brief remarks.
I think this tie between the artistic world, represented by all the people here tonight, led by Alan Lerner, really goes back to the beginnings of our party, particularly to Thomas Jefferson, who wrote a letter, which I have in the White House, to a friend in Italy, in which he asked that the three gardeners who were coming over to work at Monticello, that they should be able to sing and play in a musical symphony that he was then arranging. I think it's because the two political parties in our history have always been divided, as Emerson said, in the party of hope and the party of memory. From the time of Jefferson, I think we've been the party of hope. And therefore it's natural that artists, men and women who work in the theater and all the other related arts should find themselves most at home in the party of hope.
Among tonight's performers was Jimmy Durante, who wore a Kennedy-style wig and sang Start Off Each Day with a Song. He was followed by Peter Lawford, the president's brother-in-law, who sang I've Grown Accustomed to Your Face to Mr. Durante. In the finale, the entire cast, led by Louis Armstrong, sang When the Saints Go Marching In and danced shuffles and twists. In South Vietnam today, the Viet Cong launched a major attack against government outposts and strategic hamlets, north and south of Saigon. American officials believe this may herald the beginning of a new spring offensive by the communists. Before dawn, Red forces hit militia outposts in Vinh Binh province in the communist-infested Mekong Delta region south of Saigon. A government spokesman did not enumerate casualties, but said a number of American-made weapons had been captured by the communists. North of Saigon, 100 Viet Cong guerrillas stormed a strategic hamlet in Binh Dong province, but were driven off after losing 8 men killed and 1 captured. In related news, Ngo Dinh Nhu, brother of South Vietnam's President Ngo Dinh Diem, is reported to have complained recently that the American advisory mission in South Vietnam had grown too large. Other South Vietnamese officials have found themselves increasingly at odds with U.S. advisors regarding military strategy and execution. Roughly 12,000 Americans are assisting government troops in their fight against the Viet Cong. At his press conference Wednesday, President Kennedy, apparently annoyed by reports of Mr. Nhu's comments, was asked about the possible withdrawal of American forces from South Vietnam.
Yes, I hope we'd withdraw the troops, any number of troops, anytime the government of South Vietnam would suggest it. The day after it was suggested, we would have some troops on their way home. That's number one. Number two is we're hopeful that the situation in South Vietnam would permit some withdrawal in any case by the end of the year, but we can't possibly make that judgment at the present time. There's still a long, hard struggle to go. We've seen what's happened in Laos, which must inevitably have its effect upon South Vietnam, so that I couldn't say that today the situation is such that we could look for a brightening in the skies that would permit us to withdraw troops or begin to by the end of this year. But I would say that if requested to, we'll do it immediately. As of today, we would hope we could begin to perhaps do it at the end of the year, but we couldn't make any final judgment at all until we see the course of the struggle in the next few months.
In New York City today, Attorney General Robert F. Kennedy held an unofficial meeting with a group of prominent Negroes. His purpose was to obtain their views on combating racial discrimination in the North. James Baldwin, a prominent Negro novelist who arranged the meeting at Mr. Kennedy's request, characterized the at times heated conversation as, quote, caustic but significant, unquote. However, Mr. Baldwin said that he and the other Negroes who had attended the meeting remained unconvinced that the Attorney General understood the full extent of the racial problem in the North. Mr. Kennedy has not given his own assessment of the meeting. Mr. Baldwin said the president's brother had spent a significant portion of the meeting defending the actions of the administration in the area of civil rights. Mr. Baldwin said that when Freedom Rider Jerome Smith proposed that President Kennedy personally escort 2 Negro students into the University of Alabama, the Attorney General had replied dismissively, stating, quote, "We're not interested in performances, we're interested in results," unquote. In a recent interview, the Attorney General was asked why the civil rights movement had risen to the forefront of national attention this year.
Well, I think it's been a long time coming. I think it's years of suppression, abuse, being treated as second-class citizens and being subject to injustices. During that same period of time, in fact, the communications are so much different now than it used to be in the past. Television. This media, as well as newspapers, points out to the Negro what his secondary role has been. This plus his education and years of suppression has led to this revolt that is taking place at the present time. It was bound to come. It's just a question of when it would come.
He was asked what part the government had played in promoting action by civil rights groups.
I don't think the government plays any part in bringing it to a head. We've been trying to deal with the injustices that have existed and to enforce the laws on the books dealing with voting, schools, other matters. But as far as bringing about the situation that exists at the present time, the demonstrations that have occurred, some of the disorders that have been created in some of the cities, all of these clashes that have taken place, we have had no role. We've tried, when it's come to a head, to try to establish some communication between races in the various communities. In some cities we've been successful, in others we have not been successful, and there's still great problems.
Finally, Mr. Kennedy was asked to assess what degree of communication had been reached between whites and Negroes in recent months.
I think it varies. I think that the situation now is better than it was several months ago on a national level. But I think that at the local level, in some communities, there's absolutely no communication whatsoever. Negroes refuse to talk to whites, or whites are refusing to talk to Negroes. I think that's one problem. And then I think in other communities, the Negro leadership has not been what it might be, and therefore communication has broken down. And other cities, the political leadership of the whites has led those leaders to feel that they either cannot afford or it's not politically wise for them to talk to Negroes, communicate with Negroes, and therefore communication is broken down. So I think it varies across the country. In my judgment, communication, a real dialogue, a meaningful dialogue between the races is what's going to achieve an answer to this problem in the long run. And I don't mean just the southern cities, northern communities as well. Northern communities, frequently there's discussion, but there's a complete lack of understanding, and there's not an effort to understand, which I think frequently both sides are at fault. But I think in the last analysis it depends on a real effort by everybody to have tolerance and understanding and to try to talk and understand the other person's point of view.
On Wednesday, the Attorney General led off the administration's fight for a domestic Peace Corps by observing that millions of Americans, quote, live in unbelievable squalor, unquote. Mr. Kennedy told a House Labor Subcommittee that these underprivileged Americans can be found across the nation, from the slums of New York through the South to the Indian reservations out west, adding, quote, no matter how many orbits our astronauts make, the world will remain unimpressed if we also continue to have second-class citizens whose problems are being ignored, unquote. The administration is seeking $5 million to start a domestic Peace Corps of 1,000 volunteers to be known as the National Service Corps. I'll have more news for you after this message.
How would you like to buy a new pair of hands? Hands that are soft, hands that are smooth, hands that are lovely. New Thrill.
The first day I washed dishes with Thrill, I knew it was pretty special. Then, in a few days, my hands began to feel better, less rough and dry. In 14 days, I was delighted. My hands really were smoother, almost like new.
How much smoother? It's like getting a new pair of hands in 14 days when you switch to Procter & Gamble's mild, New Thrill.
Here again, Joe Rubenstein.
In Atlanta Wednesday, federal judge Elbert Tuttle of the Fifth Circuit Court of Appeals issued a restraining order directing education officials in Birmingham, Alabama, to reinstate 1,100 Negro students who had been suspended for participating in civil rights demonstrations. He said that in light of Monday's Supreme Court decision that voided convictions of Negroes arrested in lunch counter sit-ins and similar protests, the suspensions could not stand, adding, quote, "It seems plain that we have here a case of some 1,000 students who were engaging in legally permissible activities, illegally arrested for exercising this constitutional right," unquote. In Birmingham last night, Dr. Martin Luther King commented on Judge Tuttle's order.
Ever since we received notice of these expulsions and suspensions of some 1,000 students, we felt that the Board of Education of this city was engaging in not only an unwise act, but an undemocratic and an unconstitutional act. The decision from Judge Tuttle reveals that we were right in our assessment of this whole situation. It reveals that the students who engaged in these peaceful protests were not only moving down a path of morality, but they were moving within constitutional paths. And I think this vindicates our actions, and I think it vindicates our movement, and it reveals the justice and morality of this movement.
In Washington Tuesday, Gordon Cooper, the Air Force major who became a national hero by orbiting the Earth 22 times, received a medal from President Kennedy, an ovation from Congress, and cheers from more than 200,000 persons who had turned out to greet him. Before the president gave Major Cooper the NASA Distinguished Service Medal at a ceremony in the North Portico of the White House, Mr. Kennedy summoned 4 of the 5 other astronauts who had made space flights: Alan Shepard, Virgil Grissom, Scott Carpenter, and Walter Schirra. John Glenn is currently on a goodwill tour of Japan.
We're delighted to honor today the most recent of this very exclusive group, Major Cooper, who went furthest in space and did so on the anniversary of Charles Lindbergh's flight to Paris. Charles Lindbergh took approximately the same time to go about 1/150th of the distance of Major Cooper. Both flights were equally hazardous. Both were equally daring. I think one of the things which warmed us the most during this flight was the realization that however extraordinary computers may be, that we are still ahead of them, and that man is still the most extraordinary computer of all. His judgment, his nerve, and the lessons he can learn from experience still make him unique, and therefore make manned flight necessary, and not merely that of satellites. I know that a good many people say, why go to the moon? Just as many people said to Lindbergh, why go to Paris? I think that the United States has committed itself to this great adventure in the 60s. I think before the end of the 60s, we will see a man on the moon, to the moon, an American. And I think in so doing, it's not merely that we're interested in making this particular journey, but we are interested in demonstrating a dominance of this new sea and making sure that in this new great adventurous period, that the Americans are playing their great role as they have in the past.
Sports, right after this.
Now, a cigarette that's low in tar and nicotine, high in menthol flavor. New Montclair. Just enough in every puff makes every puff a pleasure. Smoke Montclair. New from the American Tobacco Company.
The San Francisco Giants sent Sandy Koufax to an early shower today after scoring 5 runs in the first inning and went on to beat the Los Angeles Dodgers 7-1 at Candlestick Park. Juan Marichal, the Giants' right-handed ace, gave up only 4 hits, struck out 10, and ran his record to 6-3. Asked if today's victory was the best of the season, Marichal said, quote, "Yes, because it was against the Dodgers. They're pretty good. Koufax pitched a no-hitter against me in Los Angeles, so this kind of evened things, unquote. Koufax no-hit the Giants on May 11th. The victory ended the Dodgers' 8-game winning streak and put the defending champion Giants 2 games ahead of Los Angeles. In the Dodger dressing room, Koufax said, quote, "I just got hit. Maybe I wasn't as sharp in my control as I had been, but they were really finding that ball," unquote. Dodger skipper Walter Alston said, quote, "You get hit once in a while in the major leagues, and Sandy was due to have one like this," unquote. Despite today's setback, Koufax's earned run average for the season remains a minuscule 1.71. The last National Leaguer to end the season with an ERA under 2 was Max Lanier of the St. Louis Cardinals, who did it in 1943. And finally tonight, Mickey Mantle honored Gordon Cooper Wednesday night at Yankee Stadium by rocketing a baseball off the uppermost part of the right field facade, which towers 108 feet over the playing field, a shot he called, quote, "the hardest ball I ever hit," unquote. The 11th inning blast off Bill Fisher led the Bombers to an 8-7 victory over the Kansas City Athletics. As the ball sailed a distance of 374 feet, crashed against the green copper-oxidized facade, and dropped down into the upper deck, the crowd was rendered temporarily speechless. Mantle's home run barely missed, being the first fair ball to ever be hit out of Yankee Stadium. The best estimate is that it would have gone between 500 and 550 feet if unimpeded. Yankee second baseman Bobby Richardson said of the home run, quote, "That distance would take 4 of my best shots." Mantle's roommate, Whitey Ford, said, quote, "I hit 'em that hard, only they don't go that far." Yankee manager Ralph Houck said, quote, "I wish it could have been cut into singles. We'd have enough hits for a week," unquote. In the Kansas City dugout Wednesday night, there was one man who did not see Mantle's blow. A's manager Eddie Lopat, a longtime resident of the mound at Yankee Stadium. After the game, Lopat said, quote, "I'm a pitcher. I know the sound. I just turned my back." And that, for this evening, completes our look at the latest news on this Friday, May 24th, 1963. Thank you for joining us, and have a great day tomorrow.
This has been your Evening Report, a roundup of the latest news with Joe Rubenstein.